Children say the craziest things. On a day-to-day basis, though, it's easier to believe that a kid is making something up or misinterpreting reality, rather than being 100% truthful. This is a story that should remind anyone who has kids to take them more seriously. I live alone with my 5-year-old son. My parents came over to babysit a lot during the day, but at night and early in the morning, it's just the two of us. One day, I noticed he was groggy and grumpy. I asked him if he slept okay, and he said that someone kept him up. Of course, I thought by someone he meant me, and that he was trying his best to subtly tell me to keep it down. I promised I would be quieter after he went to bed that night. However, for the next week, he never seemed to get out of that slump. He would shuffle around the house, making remarks about how mommy talks too much, or how he wanted mommy to stop messing up his room. I asked him multiple times to explain what I was doing wrong so that I could help, but every time I tried talking to him, he would look away and try to hide his feelings. I was worried he was developing some behavioral issues. My fears seemed to be confirmed when I went to wake him up one morning and he was already awake, sitting straight up in bed with a huge frown on his face. That, and his room was an absolute wreck. All his toys and clothes were strewn everywhere, looking like he'd spent all night trashing the place. Understandably, I reprimanded him for staying up past his bedtime and messing up his room. To my surprise, there wasn't any backtalk. All he did was sit there and sulk while I started to pick things up, before I thought to tell him to do it himself. I left the room and went to make breakfast while he got to it. When he came and sat down at the table, he said something that made me stop and think twice. Still upset from earlier, he grumbled. I wish people didn't have to knock to get in the house. We didn't have a doorbell, so guests and couriers would always knock. I explained what doorbells were, but when I was finished, he asked if I could install a doorbell for his window. This made a pit form in my stomach. I asked him who was knocking on his window, but he just turned and covered his face. Again, I asked him if anyone was coming to his window, but this time he shook his head. I never knew him to lie, so this was a great relief. Something still felt weird, but my mom arrived soon after and changed the whole mood. Then I went off to work. That night, though, I was determined to get to the bottom of whatever was happening. I put him to bed around 8. Then I waited for my usual bedtime around 10. I walked past his door like I was going to bed. Then, about 20 minutes later, I crept out of the room and listened outside his door. That's when I heard it, knocking on the window. I quickly opened the door to see who it was, but there was nobody there. All I saw was my son laying down facing the window. I could tell he was faking being asleep, so I whispered to him to stop tapping on his window. He said, "Okay, Mommy." Then I closed the door and let him be. At this point, he was exhibiting more than one maladaptive nighttime behavior, so I found it appropriate to set up a camera in his room. I didn't tell him about it, but it wasn't exactly hidden either. I just sat on his dresser and faced his bed. I did a similar thing the very next night, but this time, I watched on my phone from my bed. I kept an eye on the camera from 10 to 11, but didn't see anything. I had to get to sleep eventually, so I decided to let the motion detector record anything that happened overnight. However, I had some trouble sleeping, so I was still awake when my phone buzzed about an hour later. There was movement in the room. I opened up the app and saw the most haunting image of my life. Someone was crawling through my son's window. The next moments were a blur of sheer panic and rage. I grabbed the club I keep by my bed for defense. Then I rushed to my son's room. I barged through the door to see some masked person in his bed, not just on it, but under the covers with him. I screamed bloody murder and ripped them out of the sheets. Then I started wailing on them without mercy. It was only when I could finally hear the screams from the person I was beating that I finally stopped. And I recognized the voice behind the mask. It was his mother, my ex-wife. I froze as I realized what I had just done in front of my child. His mother and father had just turned into animals, one literally trying to kill the other right in front of his eyes. They were both sobbing and begging me to stop, but I just couldn't hear it in time. I called the police to let them deal with the rest. My ex was arrested for violating the restraining order I filed against her on my son's behalf. The whole reason we separated and I got full custody was because of abusive things she did when our son was much younger, but I never thought she was still so obsessed with us, and crazier than ever. I know I was within my rights to do what I did, especially considering whatever sick ways in which my ex was trying to influence our son. But I just know it traumatized him beyond belief. He'll be dealing with those awful memories for the rest of his life. If I'd only listened more closely to what he was telling me, it could have been stopped long before it came to the catastrophe that it did.